Hello, guys. So, as I promised, this is my first video, and we will be discussing some topics which I think are interesting, and students usually get confused in those things. So, I've started from the chapter of memory, which is usually considered to be one of the first chapters. And this chapter, the part which is relevant to working memory is much more trickier in comparison to the other sections. So I've started with working memory itself. So we'll be discussing today in this video about working memory. So first, to discuss about working memory, we need to have certain background information about the Atkinson and Shiffrin model of the memory, which was one of the first cognitive based models manufactured, proposed by the Atkinson and Shiffrin, two guys. So in that, we already know that there was an STM, LTM, and then there was initially the sensory store. Now, that was a primitive model which was based on a crude understanding of how memory works in its holistic aspect. So the short-term memory, STM, was one of the critical components of that memory system. So initially, it was proposed, but later, uh, when much more research was done, especially people like Badley and Hitch, they did certain research to, explore into that model, and they found that STM is not as simple as was proposed by the Atkinson and Shiffrin model. So they proposed a new name and a new model which you can fit in the same model, but the STM of that model, which is Badley and Hitch's model, is much more sophisticated, and it's called working memory. So working memory, as the name suggests, you can call it the workbench of consciousness, because unlike STM, it is much more sophisticated. So first, we will understand how the STM of Atkinson and Shiffrin is different from the working memory of Badley and Hitch. So, for Badley and Hitch, who proposed the concept of working memory, the STM model was too simple, and they claim that it's not a single store. But instead of single store, it has multiple stores. So, for them working, they proposed three stores. So we all know that it's one of them is central executive, the part which controls the three stores. Three stores are phonological loop, episodic buffer, and visual spatial sketchpad. But the difference between STM and LTM is that the difference between STM and working memory is that STM was a passive store. Processing was not as sophisticated as was proposed by Badley and Hitch, and it was just a gateway towards the LTM, that is long term memory. But in reality, if we see, people are very good in doing calculations at small intervals. So they can even do very good and complex tasks at the present time. So basically, working memory is something which explains a relatively good capacity of people's memory doing complex tasks, which includes many things, such as you have reading, comprehension, reasoning, okay, all at current moment, which the STM part of the Atkinson and Shiffrin model could not explain. Okay, so these two things should be very clear, that working memory is a good advance over the STM part of the Atkinson and Shiffrin. Second, how did they come about it? So Badley and Hitch actually proved that the STM part of the Atkinson Shiffrin is more complicated than being a single store. Why is that? Because the STM part of Atkinson and Shiffrin proposed that the memory and the processing used to happen in the same store. That is, STM of Atkinson Shiffrin stores as well as processes. So, on experimentation, Badley and Hitch found that it is not the case. How did they do it? They used dual task interference paradigm. So what is dual task interference paradigm? Dual task interference paradigm, in simple words, assumes that if a task selectively interferes with a particular type of processing but not with another type, only one type of processing is being interfered and not with another type, it means that those two types of processing must rely on some different cognitive processes. So when Badley and Hitch actually gave subjects distractor tasks, such as for example counting numbers, while simultaneously giving them tasks for reasoning. So two tasks were there, reasoning and then counting numbers. They expected that the counting number part will actually badly impact the reasoning part. So the counting number part is the memory part and the reasoning part is the reasoning part. But what they did found was that these two tasks did not interfere with each other, which eventually showed that at the present moment, that's what the workbench part means. That is, things are happening in short term. That is STM. So these two things, reasoning and counting numbers, were being controlled by two separate processes. So the interference was not observed. So through dual task interference paradigm, through dual task methodology, they proved that this STM is not a single store, it is much more sophisticated. So they proved that it's a multiple store model rather than a single store model. That is, its STM is not one, it is divided into something. So they proposed three things eventually. One was phonological loop, another was episodic buffer, and the third part was visual spatial sketchpad. These three things basically was proposed. Out of these three stores, episodic buffer was a later addition, and C, which was central executive, used to control all these things. So now comes the good part of it. The central executive part in this thing is the controller of all the three stores, which is phonological loop, episodic buffer, and visual spatial sketchpad. All three connect with central executive. Central executive activates the structures in the long-term memory. Okay, so central executive is like the manager of these three stores, giving them the work, deciding when to switch on these memories and their processes and when to switch off, how to connect central executive with the LTM. It is in fact the most versatile component of the whole thing, the whole structure. So central executive used to connect with the long-term memory, especially the episodic memory part of it. So if you see, the central executive, phonological loop, episodic buffer, and visual spatial sketchpad, these four things form the what is called as the fluid part of the fluid system, okay, which is operating at the moment. These four are together operating at the moment, and this is the working memory, the workbench of consciousness, these four things. And the episodic memory, the visual semantics, the language, and the other parts of the LTM. This is all LTM, the things which I told. The episodic memory, the LTM part, the visual semantics, this is again the LTM part, and the language, this is again the LTM part. These three are the crystallized components. So the workbench, working memory is the fluid component, language, episodic memory, and visual semantics are the crystallized components, and these two things actually connect with each other through the central executive. And even with the three things also, it's actually not very well known how the model works, because Badley and Hitch are still trying to discover how the model actually works. And every day new things are coming up, the research is still not complete. So you can understand that these two things, these two systems, the fluid system and the crystallized system, are connected with each other and through central executive. Now these three parts are very important: phonological loop, episodic buffer, and visual spatial sketchpad. We'll discuss it one by one. So the first part is phonological loop. Beg your pardon. First we'll discover the central executive. Central executive drives the whole system. It is the boss of the working memory in one words. It allows data to the subsystems. That is Visual Spatial Sketchpad, phone logical loop, and then episodic buffer also works in communion with these two memory stores. It deals with cognitive tasks, mental, arithmetic, and problems, and it acts as a delegating authority, attention deployment, switching on the attention, switching off the attention, central and coordination. It doesn't store much because it's already loaded with so much of work. Then uh, it is not full of modalities. Modalities means qualities. That is its own identity is more sort of a functional identity rather than being fixed roles. Having fixed roles, it doesn't have much of a fixed roles, but it's much more fluid. Okay. Then it oversees the storage done by the component systems. That's what the main function is. Then you can discuss about the evidence of the central executive. That is, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, the C's get destroyed. Prefrontal cortex usually is considered to be the location where C is located. You have dysexecutive syndrome where people have a sense of perseveration. That is, they when they decide something, they are not able to, switch to another option. So if they study a menu in a hotel, they can't decide. They just go on repeating one dish while ordering to the waiter. So all these kinds of things are something which is related with central executive.